I'm Kaya Allo, and welcome to Ink and Spine, a space between words and sound, where each week we sit together with a book, a film, or an album, savoring each at the sweet pace of honey. Let's begin. Thank you again for tuning in for another episode of Ink and Spine. Last week, we reviewed chapters 5 through 11. That's a lot of girth. How you doing? Today, we review chapters 12 to 14. And though the chapters are few today, the sweetness that we savor is substantial sustenance. May this episode find you in the being and the doing of that which is grounding for you, allowing for your breath to flow, opening passageways to reflect in that which is uniquely yours. Some footing before we begin today's review. Barack is now in his third year as a community organizer on Chicago's far south side. He's working with a coalition of churches in Roseland and in the Alt-Geld Gardens, a public housing project that is hemmed by a landfill and a sewage plant. At this point in time, he's in his mid-20s, and he's earning very little in comparison to his wage in New York. He spends most of his days in church basements and living rooms trying to convince ordinary people that they do have power. These 3 chapters are the end of this season of organizing for Barack. For now, I do hope that you'll have the chance to read along on your own, either by grabbing the book from your local library or purchasing through the link in the show notes, or most preferably at your local bookstore. But have no fear. If you haven't read, the idea of this podcast is sweetness and ease as we take in this sustenance that is substantial. Let's begin with chapter 12. Now, some helpful context about Chicago at this time in 1983. Harold Washington is Chicago's first Black mayor. He's elected in 1983 after a campaign that registered tens of thousands of new Black voters in this historic and monumental election. To the crowd in Roseland, he is returning as more than a politician. He is proof of possibility to these people. But further along in chapter 14, we learn of Washington's humanity. I noticed that Barack refers to Washington as the mayor, as opposed to a familiar reference like Harold or Harry or Washington. I'm curious if this gives a telling critique of Washington's easy dissonance towards those in community, dun dun dun, who got him elected. I'll refer to MET, M-E-T, and that is the Mayor's Office of Employment and Training. And this is a job intake center that Barack's organization fought to bring to Roseland. I find it poetic that this initiative begins in an empty storefront. On page 121, the ribbon was cut, and that was it. As the limousine sped away to the next event, the crowd dispersed almost instantly, leaving just a few of us standing in the litter-blown road. I walked over to Angela, who was busy talking to Shirley and Mona. When I heard him say Miss Ryder, she said, I swear I just about died. Shirley shook her head. Girl, don't I know it? We got the pictures to prove it. Mona said this holding up her Instamatic camera. I tried to break in. Did we get a date for the rally? Barack seems to be the only one of his colleagues who has stayed focused on the original goal, that they are supposed to get the mayor to attend their upcoming rally to continue garnering support for their causes. The women continue their kiki on page 122. So then he tells me I look too young to have a 14-year-old daughter. Can you imagine? Did he agree to come to our rally? I repeated. The three of them looked at me impatiently. What rally? This passage on page 122 reminds me of something I'd first heard from Black Thought of the Roots. But in research, I've discovered that this quote is actually attributed to Larry Gelbart, where he refers to the impact of the weapons of mass distraction. How silencing those weapons are, but how impactful. Because in this case, the fandom and the pomp and circumstance seems to cloud the mission. The women are so taken by the celebrity of this man who has, rightfully so, made historical impact. But they forget that the everyday mission, that is their focus. After this interaction that seems to only bother Barack, he later on tries to light a cigarette and even the wind is pissing him off. But he backtracks a little bit to give us some insight of what has happened between chapters 11 and 12. At this point, Barack has parted ways with Marty. Marty is who originally hires Barack in New York and invites him to begin this adventure in Chicago. And Barack writes this of his new year in organizing on page 123. Almost a year had passed since my arrival in Chicago, and our labor had finally begun to bear fruit. The street corner group had grown to 50 strong. They organized neighborhood cleanups, sponsored career days for area youth, won agreements from the aldermen to improve sanitation services, and now the new job intake center, where once only an empty storefront had been. As the organizers' stock had grown, so had my own. Local politicians knew my name, even if they couldn't still pronounce it. The appreciation of those you worked with, concrete improvements in the neighborhood, those were things that you could hang a price tag on. Barack continues on page 124 as he talks about real change, but ultimately the non-linear nature of change. On page 124, yes, real change. It had seemed like such an attainable goal back in college, an extension of my personal will and my mother's faith, like boosting my grade point average or giving up liquor. A matter of taking and assigning responsibility. Only now, after a year of organizing, nothing seemed simple. Teachers, drug counselors, policemen. Some were there only for the paycheck. Others sincerely wanted to help, but whatever their motives, they would all at some point confess a common weariness, a weariness that was bone deep. They had lost whatever confidence they might have once had in their ability to reverse the deterioration they saw all around them. With that loss of confidence came a loss in the capacity for outrage. The idea of responsibility slowly eroded, replaced with gallows of humor and low expectations. Without judgment, we all need to get to the bag. We can't go to the grocery store with a badge or platitudes to buy milk. But what happens now? I'm grateful for the ways that this book seems long and tedious in detailing the winding maze that is Barack's work in organizing. As you're reflecting and following along, what changes today versus 2020 for you? Further along in the chapter, we learn about an influential woman named Dr. Martha Collier on page 125. It was Dr. Martha Collier who eventually lifted me out of my funk. She was the principal of Carver Elementary, one of the 2 elementary schools out in Elgeld. She'd been a teacher for 2 decades and a principal for 10 years. She was accustomed to skirmishes with superiors. I recently learned about the root of the word decision and what it actually means. And it is the cutting away of. I never thought about the word decision in this way. And I'm curious if thinking about it in this context of its root origin changes the word for you as well. On page 126, we learn about Barack's heart for this work. As the teacher tried to direct them up the stairs, the kids, I thought how happy and trusting they all seemed. That despite the rocky arrivals many of them had gone through, delivered prematurely, or delivered into addiction, most of these kids already smudged with the ragged air of poverty. The joy they seemed to find in simple locomotion, the curiosity they displayed towards each and every new face. It seemed the equal of children anywhere. I can hear the school bell ringing, the commotion before the first class starts. Dr. Collier interrupts Barack by asking, "Beautiful, aren't they?" They really are. Dr. Collier continues by saying, "The change comes later, in about 5 years, although it seems like it's coming sooner all the time, when their eyes stop laughing. Their throats can still make the sound, but if you look at their eyes, you can see they've shut off something inside." I am in awe of educators, especially educators in a place like the Chicago South Side at this time. We learn later on, as Barack is getting acquainted with Dr. Collier, that she is committed to investing in the individuals that she is encountering within those school walls. In particular, there's 2 women, Linda and Bernadette. And these are 2 sisters that Dr. Collier has helped get their high school equivalencies. But at this point in time, when Barack encounters Dr. Collier, Bernadette is taking classes at community college. Linda is pregnant again, and she's now staying at home to look after Bernadette's son, Tyrone, and her own daughter, Jewel. On page 127, she, meaning Linda, said that she'd be going to college again too, once this new baby was born. After that, she and Bernadette would find jobs, in food management maybe, or as secretaries. They point to the bright white kitchen walls and hardwood floors on some clippings from Better Homes and Gardens. They tell me that they would have such a home one day. Tyrone would take swimming lessons, they said, and Jewel would dance ballet. Sometimes, listening to such innocent dreams, I would find myself fighting off the urge to gather up these girls and their babies in my arms, to hold them all tight and never let go. And I would realize that in my own way, I must have seemed as innocent to them as they both seemed to me. I deviate from the book slightly to talk about a really cool experience that I had this week. A really cool screening of the film True Stories by David Byrne of the Talking Heads. If you're in Calgary, check out Electric Cinema Club. They host monthly movie screenings of curated selections by the organizers, and they are beautifully tasteful. Amongst mostly strangers, we watched the film together. We laughed at the same moments, and we were made reflective by others. But it got me thinking about something that happens to all of us as human beings. It's a deviation from that collective seeing I don't know where the deviation happens in the strange ways that we treat each other. Like, for example, we all know how shitty it feels to be ghosted. So why do we still ghost others? But I thought more about the contradictions of Donald Trump. Here he is married to an immigrant whose accent is a dead giveaway of her origin from a different place. And that's not a bad thing. But where does the separation between Melania and other immigrants begin, and how? What is the metric of this separation, of othering? I thought further about his reference to NFL athletes who knelt for the national anthem in what feels like a long time ago in 2017. He referred to these athletes as sons of bitches. Who gave birth to those sons? Who gave birth to his sons? What does he make of the mothers of his sons? How do they differ to the mothers of other sons? This rabbit hole of thought ends with a conversation that I recently listened to between Oprah and Sean Achor. He is a psychology researcher, and they were discussing this term I'd never heard before called stereotype threat. Have you guys heard of that before? But to give you a little bit of my new understanding, stereotype threat is the situational risk of confirming a negative stereotype about a group that one belongs to, and the way that risk itself can hijack performance as a result. This term, stereotype threat, comes from psychologists Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson in a 1995 study that they conducted. They observed that Black college students scored markedly lower on a difficult verbal test when it was framed as a measure of intellectual ability, and comparably to their white counterparts when the identical test was framed as a simple problem-solving exercise. The stereotype seems to be in the air, influenced by the environment that we breathe, that specific air. As we continue our explorations, I feel like I'm arriving at better clarity about the meaning of letting go. As I advocate for myself, there are so many folks who, without anywhere near the same lived experience as mine, have drowned me in this phrase. Let it go, let it go, let it go, they say. But I don't think they understand what letting go means, and that it takes on a different meaning for their lived experience versus mine or anyone else's. As I'm making sense of what letting go actually means for me, I'm learning that this misunderstanding has been the cause of a pattern of my internal system's consistent failure. You see, since I was a little girl, coming to this place, I've taken on and taken on and taken on. And there is a detrimental compounding that has happened where, at this point in the present, I am now having to respond to the serious warning signs of my physiology. I am no longer a machine that can be mind over matter or body. My body has been, to be a little cliche, keeping the score, and the score is getting really serious. Continuing to swallow the consequences and choices of others is actually not letting it go for me. It is actually to take on. And I was not designed to be anything but a human being. Let's continue. Chapter 12 ends on a pivotal note. And with the spoiler alert of history, we become aware that this moment seems to have been a founding pillar of what shaped Barack's political endurance and his stamina. For context, there's a resident named Sadie Evans who finds a legal notice, and essentially there is asbestos in her building. And Sadie, along with Linda and Bernadette and a handful of others, ride a yellow school bus to downtown Chicago to the CHA, which is the Chicago Housing Authority. A TV crew manages to show up, and suddenly the officials that haven't been returning their calls or conducting the promised testings appear. And this is the organization and the organizers' first taste of leverage. The leverage that they have created by being ordinary people that have just refused to quit. I'm in deep admiration of Sadie's small and honest steps. She seems to crack open this reservoir on page 131. I changed as a result of that bus trip in a fundamental way. It was the sort of change that's important not because it alters your concrete circumstances in some way, but because it hints at what might be possible and therefore spurs you on beyond the immediate exhilaration, beyond any subsequent disappointments, to retrieve that thing that you once ever so briefly held in your hand. That bus ride kept me going, and maybe it still does. This passage on page 131, I wanted to tattoo it on the inside of my eyeballs. I read this part over and over and over again. I almost wanted the honey to last, to infuse it into my own fuel reserves permanently. We finished chapter 12 with a passage from page 132. I began to see something wonderful happening. The parents began talking about ideas for future campaigns. New parents got involved, with Linda and her swollen belly waddling door to door to collect complaint forms. Mr. Lucas, another helpful organizer, unable to read the forms himself, explained to neighbors how to fill them out properly. Even those who had been opposed to our efforts earlier began to come around. It was as though Sadie's small and honest step had truly broken into a reservoir of hope, allowing the people in Altgeld to reclaim a power that they had had all along. We ride into chapter 13 on that wave of hope that seemed to have been sparked by Sadie in chapter 12. And it is interesting to me that Barack includes these seemingly inconsequential occurrences throughout the book. But then as I continue reading, I keep having these aha moments. For example, as they are preparing for this event in chapter 13, there is a microphone that doesn't work. Now we are in the era of everybody being able to get a microphone, and I am one of them. Hello. And who deserves a podcast and who doesn't? Well, shoot. That's up to you to decide and where you decide to put your time. But I wonder if it is akin to the advent of multiple TV channels. Like y'all remember in school when it was a flex to have channels that went into the 1200s on TV. Remember the HD channels? Maybe this is that evolution of choice. Because who is the limiting decider? Imagine only one bread brand, one milk company, one ice cream shop in your city. What a dull life. But anyway, back to this microphone. It seems that as we begin a new assignment, and I think especially about Sadie and this crew of courageous organizers, they're beginning something that they have never seen before. And somehow they are able to muster up courage and belief for a possibility beyond their current imagination. It's like the crack of the voice before it can be sure of itself. First it cracks, Then it figures out its volume, and then it's heard. The momentum of the bus ride crests into this big public meeting with the CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority. The director pulls up, but it collapses on logistics and nerves of these well-meaning folks who are just finding their legs of courage and power. With the microphone having no sound, the crowd's patience seemed to snap, and the director skirts without any tangible follow-ups. And now Sadie, who has mustered this new courage, blames herself for everything going wrong. She says to Barack on page 134, "I'm so embarrassed. I don't know what happened, Barack. With all the people, it seems like I just always mess things up." "You didn't mess up," I said. As I'm still learning my own sea legs of what is effective advocacy versus what should be thrown in the trash, I have so much empathy for Sadie, because you don't know what you don't know. And that's something that I wish I could have told all of the lawyers and justices in the courtrooms that I attended for the first time, that I was not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. Dr. Collier is right there for Barack. On page 134, "We would learn from our mistakes, but I felt my stomach constrict." Dr. Collier tapped me on the shoulder. "So who's going to cheer you up?" she said. I shook my head. "You take some chances. Things are going to blow once in a while." I know Dr. Collier is supposed to be comforting in this moment, but nothing about this is comforting. But at the same time, I'm envisioning this wise and experienced OG giving Barack the honest comfort in a moment like this. That there isn't any platitude that one can say that is true, but that is just the acknowledgement of what is, and sometimes that's enough. Later on, we find out that after so many follow-ups, the CHA gets back to the people, and he says, "Let me be blunt. CHA has no chance of getting even half the appropriation it's requested. You can have the asbestos removed, or you can have new plumbing and roofing where it's needed, but you cannot have both. So you're telling us that after all of this, we're going to be worse off than we was?" Bernadette said. Bernadette hoisted Tyrone up on her lap. "Tell that to him." And in this moment, Bernadette is pointing to her baby Tyrone and looking directly at the CHA representative whose "I'm sorry" means nothing. Chapter 13 continues in a way that life continues. No real answers to questions we are asking. But so it is. At this point in time, as we progress through the chapter, Barack is meeting with a school counselor named Asante Morin. And this is a school counselor who is tasked with being their support for school initiatives that they are trying to get off the ground. On page 141, walking Johnny, Barack's associate, and me to the door, Asante asked me about my name, and I told him about my background. "I thought so," Asante smiled. "You know, that's where I went for my first trip to the continent, Kenya, 15 years ago. But I remember that trip like it was yesterday. Changed my life forever. The people were so welcoming. And the land, I'd never seen anything so beautiful. It really felt like I'd come home." His face glowed with the memory. "When was the last time you were back?" I hesitated. "Actually, I've never been there." Asante looked momentarily confused. "Well, he said after a pause. I'm sure when you do make the trip, it'll change your life too. And with that, he shook our hands, waved in a young man waiting in the hall, and shut the door behind him. Johnny and I left, and we were quiet for most of the ride back to our office. We hit a patch of traffic, and Johnny turned to me and said, "Can I ask you something, Barack?" "Sure." "Why haven't you ever gone to Kenya?" "I don't know. Maybe I'm scared of what I'll find out." Johnny lit a cigarette and rolled down the window to let out the smoke. "It's funny," he said, "how listening to Asante back there made me think about my old man. I mean, it's not like my old man is real educated or nothing. He doesn't even know anything about Africa. After my mother died, he had raised me and my brothers on his own, drove a delivery truck for Spiegels for 20 years. They laid him off before his pension vested. So he's still working for another company, but doing the same thing every day, lifting other people's furniture. And I hope in a moment like this in the book that you are able to take pause wherever you are and whatever you're doing, just to marvel at the serendipity of even the smallest moments in your day. When I think about indefinite holds and divine timing, this is it. Because what are the odds that after putting his trip on an indefinite hold to Kenya in the earlier chapters we explored, Barack encounters this stranger, Asante, who talks about his own home, his place of origin that he has never been to. But it's the last line of what Johnny says, lifting other people's furniture. That got me. I remember being the only Black student in my high school at that time. And during grade 11 in Canada, where the future becomes a more serious endeavor, I remember this like it was today. The Chem 20 teacher walked up to my desk before the class began, and he was the only Indigenous faculty member. He leaned close and he said, "You know, receptionists and secretaries don't need chemistry or the sciences. You can drop this class." He didn't know me. He'd never asked about my aspirations, my goals, nothing. I will never forget this moment. And each time during my current experience where I've tried to embody the piece of acceptance of what is, the expected limitations that have been imposed by those around me for someone who looks like me in their context, I'm haunted by the vividness of this memory. But that's the unnamed perk of attending a school like I did. It is the illumination that the floor is actually not the ceiling, no matter how hard they continue to try to convince me of that. For you, I'm curious if you are able to be in this reflection for yourself. Are you contorting your purpose, your assignments? Do you really believe that that is the ceiling? Or is that what someone else has told you? On this car ride in traffic, Barack begins to think about Asante again. He writes, "I started thinking about those posters back in Asante's office. Posters of Nefertiti, regal and dark-hued in her golden throne. Shaka Zulu, fierce and proud in his leopard skin tunic. And then, further back to that day years ago, before my father came for his visit to Hawaii, when I'd gone to the library in search of my own magic kingdom, my own glorious birthright. I wondered how much difference those posters would make to the boy we had just left in Asante's office. Probably not as much as Asante himself, I thought. A man willing to listen. a hand placed on a young man's shoulders. This is on page 141. As a helpful research aside, asante in Swahili is an expression of gratitude. But I found it interesting that when we moved to Ghana, specifically Twi, one of Ghana's languages, asante holds a different meaning and then a different pronunciation. It becomes Ashanti, and it now means because of war or warlike. It seems to be the dichotomy of what it is to be human. We have two hands, one to hold gratitude and then the other to hold war. This passage reminded me to take pause. Sweet gratitude. As we are evolving alongside technology, I am forever grateful for the enduring power of literature. It remains the medium that has kept the light alit on possibilities beyond the worlds that I know and knew. When I read passages like these, I'm reminded of the subconscious ways that we are shaped by so much around us, referring back to our new term, stereotype threat. And though the memory is vivid of that chemistry teacher, as he made an attempt to impose a ceiling on my potential, but there seems to be something in my subconscious that has contributed to the disbelief that that truly was the ceiling. I don't know if this is Canadian specific, but y'all remember those random PD days that we get off in the school year? I think they're called professional development days. But for me, I was not allowed to have friends or to go to anyone's house. So on those days, I went to the only permissible place, the library. I would either take the bus or the train or a combination of both. And it was in those rows that I discovered books. I also discovered my love for music because of the library. Blessings to the staff pick section where library staff would put books, music, DVDs at the time that they enjoyed. And I'll never forget walking past and being stopped by Erykah Badu's cover of Mama's Gun. I remember popping the CD into my Discman, having nowhere else to go, and spending an entire day with Mama's Gun. In those aisles and books and the different people I encountered at the library, I give gratitude for the ways that helped my subconscious dismantle those ceilings of limitation. I can imagine with each bus ride home, the world I was seeing outside of the window, the world I knew, it wasn't the same as that which I saw coming to the library. And for that, I'm forever grateful to the library for the ways that it has kept me alive in that way. Advocating and striving for more than this floor that they are trying to convince me is the ceiling. For you, I'd love to know what experiences have shaped your subconscious in similar ways. In what ways have you become aware that the floor is not the ceiling? Back to chapter 13. After this meeting with Asante, Barack is impacted and he leaves Chicago for a few days to visit his brother, Roy, in Washington, D.C. Don't worry, you haven't missed anything. We're all new to Roy. Barack lets us know that he had made this introduction to his kin during Alma's visit a few chapters back. To that indefinite hold and divine timing, had Barack never left New York, he would have never taken this opportunity to move to Chicago. He would have never met Alma. And he would have never encountered her beautiful wisdom that was healing of their old man. And she would have never initiated that casual phone call between Barack to introduce him to Roy. What are the odds that of all places in the world, Barack and Roy would not only be in the same country, They'd be on the same coast, so close to each other. Isn't the divinity of indefinite holds so beautiful? But, as is the pattern of whatever is out there orchestrating alongside our free will, Barack's arrival in Washington, D.C. is not as jovial as that with Alma. Roy asks Barack to stay at a hotel instead of his house in a sudden change of plans. And this reminded me of Barack Sr. being unable to bring his wife and son to Kenya because of varying pressures, allegedly. But it also reminds me of Barack Jr.'s arrival in New York in earlier chapters, where he eventually spends his first night in New York City in an alley amongst garbage because his friend is unresponsive to his phone calls. There's this persistent displacement that pervades so much of Barack's story. But then, without being able to prepare or have enough time for despair or complaining, Barack just gets on with it. Barack and Roy's first meeting is this weird encounter. It's an avoidance trauma dump. Roy seems to have had a fight with his wife, and that is the apparent reason that Barack can no longer stay with them. Now, Roy's wife seems to have valid reason for this fight. She is in protest of Roy's drinking and him staying out late. What stands out in this initial encounter, where Roy skips pleasantries and the good feelings of a welcome, is the intensity of Barack Sr.'s lasting impact long after his death. Barack Sr.'s impact is far-reaching beyond their continent of origin. His reach follows Alma to Germany. It stays with Barack from Hawaii to Indonesia and back again. And now this weed with this intense root system has infiltrated Roy's life all the way in Washington, D.C. On page 143, "I think we're getting divorced," he said. "I'm sorry. She says she's tired of me staying out late. She says I drink too much. She says I'm becoming just like the old man." "Well, what do you think?" "What do I think?" He lowered his head and then looked at me somberly. "The truth is, I don't think I really like myself. And I blame the old man for this." For the next hour at this restaurant, Roy recounted all the hard times that Alma had spoken of being yanked away from his mother and everything familiar, the old man's sudden descent into poverty, the arguments and breakdown and eventual flight. He told me about his life after leaving our father's house, how, bouncing from relative to relative, he had gained admission to the University of Nairobi, then secured a job with a local accounting firm after graduation, how he had taught himself the discipline of work, the same stubborn strength that had lifted them out of bad circumstances. Except in Alma, I had sensed a willingness to put the past behind her, a capacity to somehow forgive if not necessarily forget. Roy's memories of the old man seemed more immediate, more taunting. For him, the past remained an open sore. That's on page 143 to 144. Something I wanted to link back to from chapter 13, where Barack first meets Dr. Collier and they are letting the kids back into class before they have their meeting, and Dr. Collier notices Barack marveling at the innocence of the children. It's almost like that is Dr. Collier giving Barack that lesson that he needs to lift the veil of this part of his innocence. That in 5 years, as she describes, that magic fades. And it's in the way chapter 13 ends that Barack is able to discern and understand what it actually looks like when the magic fades. On page 145, Roy looked at me and smiled. "I can tell you worry too much, Barack. That's my problem as well. I think we need to learn to go with the flow." "Isn't that what you say in America? Just go with the flow? Roy laughed again, loud enough for the people at the next table to turn around. Only the magic was gone. It sounded hollow, as if it were traveling across a vast, empty distance. This was a very humbling passage for me to read, and I'm curious how this lands for you in your own reflection. For me, I've been able to keep that magic alive with substitute forms of fuel. I often describe the experience I've had thus far as having a car on the highway, but instead of having regular full tires, I've been riding on those skinny spares that are only supposed to go up to 80 kilometers in for a very short distance. But I've been riding them for decades. And now my tires are bald. It's metal scraping on road. I can no longer substitute gas for this vegetable oil I've been putting into the tank. And my system is breaking down. I'm so grateful for the internet and technology and the ways that we can find a voice. This is the most alive I've felt in the last few years. I felt the need to express in this way that I hope is helpful for someone else out there, because I was starting to feel that as this magic was fading and I am losing the inability to keep the mask on and pretend that I am okay living in this way, I needed to verbalize, even if it is through these sweet art forms of books and films and music. I'm doing my best to stay alive, and I think we all are in different ways. But I hope that as you are reflecting on chapter 13, that you are reflecting on the honesty of where your magic sits right now. Where is your magic meter? I know that sounds cheesy, but if you can get over the cheesiness, truly, where is your magic meter? With that breath that we mentioned at the beginning, can you return to it? Even if it means just taking a pause from the episode, I hope that you're able to make some time for you, because I think that is a part of what makes life worth living and life so sweet. We feel most alive when we are being together. I'm right here with you, sweetness. Okay, chapter 14. I hope you've had a chance to take some cleansing breaths, sip on something, maybe something sweet. I'm currently drinking a tea called Calming Nirvana. We continue. Chapter 14 is a transition from Barack's time as an organizer in Chicago to what lies beyond. I hope now you can understand the rationale of why episode 5 was so girthy. The intention behind this plan, this map for us, was to end in this way where we transition with hope to what lies beyond. In chapter 14, we are reminded that Barack has been previously admitted to Harvard Law, and he is dilly-dallying in telling his comrades of his departure. He does it in dribs and drabs, and with each telling, it seems to be preceded by a guilt that is of his own making. We read on page 149, "The minute I told him, Johnny, the schools which I'd applied, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, he'd grinned and slapped me on the back. 'I knew it,' he shouted. 'Knew what?' 'That this was just a matter of time, Barack, before you were out of here.' 'Why'd you think that?' Johnny shook his head and laughed. 'Damn, Barack. 'Cause you got options. That's why. 'Cause you can leave. I mean, I know you're a conscientious brother and all, But when somebody's got a choice between Harvard and Roseland, it's only so long before somebody's going to keep choosing Roseland. Again, he shook his head. Harvard? God damn. I just hope you remember your friends when you up in that fancy office downtown. For some reason, Johnny's laughter had made me defensive. I insisted that I'd be coming back to the neighborhood. I told him that I didn't plan on being dazzled by the wealth and power that Harvard represented, and that he shouldn't be either. Johnny put his hands up in mock surrender. Hey, you don't need to be telling me all this. I ain't the one going anywhere. I don't know about you, but I'm Team Johnny on this one. I cannot relate to Barack's inner turmoil here, especially with the fact that he has made this seemingly wise choice based off of actual experience. Like in New York, he tried it out as a finance writer and researcher and made really good money, and then took this adventurous risk to Chicago and lost so much. You would think that Harvard would be a sigh of relief for Barack, but he continues this inner turmoil on page 148 by saying, "That's the story I'd been telling myself, the same story I had imagined my father telling himself 28 years before, as he had boarded that plane to America, the land of dreams. He too had probably believed he was acting out some grand design, that he wasn't simply fleeing from possible inconsequence. And, in fact, he had returned to Kenya, hadn't he? But only as a divided man. His plans, his dreams, soon turned to dust. Would the same thing happen to me? Maybe Johnny was right. Maybe once you stripped away the rationalizations, it always comes down to a simple matter of escape. An escape from poverty or boredom or crime or the shackles of your skin." I'm curious, as you are reflecting on this passage from page 148 to 149, if there is resonance for you. Barack seems to continue his wrestling with this choice, and I wonder if at this time he'd even allowed himself a moment or an opportunity to celebrate the feat of being accepted into Harvard. I would be so curious to hear what that moment was like when he opened that letter of acceptance. But eventually, Barack settles on this passage from page 151, on being right with self. It reads, "But to be right with yourself, to do right by others, to take part in its healing, that required something more. It required the kind of commitment that Dr. Collier made every day in Altgeld. It reminded me of the kind of sacrifices a man like Asante had been willing to make with his students. It required faith. I glanced up now at the small second-story window of the church, imagining the old pastor inside, drafting his sermon for the week. Where did your faith come from?" he'd asked. It suddenly occurred to me that I didn't have an answer. Perhaps still I had faith in myself, but faith in oneself was never enough. I stamped out my cigarette and started the car. I looked into my rearview mirror and, driving off, watched the old silent card players recede from my sight. In the ways that invisible force gives us clarity in times that we need it most, Chapter 14 sunsets with Barack's introduction to the late Reverend Wright. I would highly recommend the 3-part docuseries on HBO called Obama in Pursuit of a More Perfect Union, because in that documentary, we get to hear from the late Reverend in his own words. And if you are familiar with Reverend Wright, you will know that those words are honest. But to give you a little bit of context of the significance of Reverend Wright in Barack Obama's life, Reverend Wright married Barack and Michelle. He also baptized the Obama girls. And it is Reverend Wright's sermon that we will hang up our reading hats on today. The sermon that inspired the title of Barack's second book, The Audacity of Hope, which was published in 2006. In the documentary, I think you will find helpful context and illumination around the rupture of their relationship as excerpts of Wright's sermons became a campaign firestorm. Barack seemingly answered with his speech titled A More Perfect Union in Philadelphia before leaving the church that spring. This seemed to be Barack's response at putting out the flames of controversy before they threatened his historic campaign. There's a matter-of-factness about Reverend Wright that seems to have bled into Barack, a stoicism that seems to have become a part of his toolkit. I'm curious if Barack would agree about that influence from Reverend Wright. But on page 152, he describes this iconic figure in this way. I'm not the church, Barack. If I die tomorrow, I hope the congregation will give me a decent burial. I like to think a few tears will be shed, but as soon as I'm 6 feet under, they'll be right back on the case, figuring out how to make this church live up to its mission. He, meaning Reverend Wright, had grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a Baptist minister. He had resisted his father's vocation at first, joining the Marines out of college. He dabbled with liquor, Islam, and Black nationalism in the 60s. But the call of his faith had apparently remained, a steady tug on his heart. And eventually he entered Howard, then the University of Chicago, where he spent 6 years studying for a PhD in the history of religion. He learned Hebrew and Greek, the anger and humor of the streets, the book learning and occasional 25-cent word. All of this he had brought with him to Trinity almost 2 decades ago. I love this helpful context that Barack gives us of Reverend Wright, because is that not the beauty of what makes life so colorful? For me, this was helpful to read as I'm reminded that no exciting journey is ever linear. And as we encounter more of the characters that have helped to create these bridges of Barack's iconic journey, I hope that you too are able to take pause and allow breath for the unique makings of whatever your journey is. That it is okay for our lives to be an advanced level cornfield maze. But we do hope that eventually we make it out alive. It appears that this mantra, the audacity of hope, is clarified and implanted into Barack because of Reverend Wright's sermon. How beautiful that Barack bids farewell to Chicago, for now, with this lasting sweetness, an effective toolkit of how to truly place a lasting and permanent floor on despair with a stomp. But perhaps for some, it is better articulated with a harp string. For others, it's a shovel. Page 159. We begin with Reverend Wright speaking. And yet consider once again the painting before us. Hope, like Hannah. That harpist is looking upwards, a few faint notes floating upward toward the heavens. She dares to hope. She has the audacity to make music and praise God on the one string that she has left. People began to shout, to rise from their seats and clap and cry out. a forceful wind carrying the Reverend's voice up into the rafters. As I watched and listened from my seat, I began to hear all the notes from the past 3 years swirling about me. The courage, the fear, the desire to let go, the desire to escape. And in that single note, hope. I heard something else. At the foot of that cross, inside the thousands of churches across the city, I imagined the stories of ordinary people merging with the stories of Goliath and David, Moses and Pharaoh. These stories of survival and freedom and hope became our stories, my story. Our trials and triumphs became at once unique and universal. In chronicling our journey, the stories and songs gave us a means to reclaim memories that we didn't need to feel ashamed about. Memories more accessible than those of ancient Egypt. Memories that all people might study and cherish, and with which we could still start to rebuild. That's on page 159. The harpist that is referred to here is Hope, and it is painted by George Frederick Watts in 1886. It depicts a blindfolded woman in rags, and she is seated on top of the globe, bent over a lyre with every string broken, except for one, straining to hear the note, still able to make music with just that one string. It is this beautiful depiction that we end our review of chapters 12 to 14 today. But we contrast that with the sudden passing of Harold Washington in this chapter, the mayor, the limo riding superstar from chapter 12, now suddenly gone. The suddenness of a heart attack. I found it interesting as I contrasted this with what is happening in this present time, July of 2026, with the sudden passing of Lindsey Graham. Without seeping into the unproductive nature of judgment, I kept thinking about these questions as the news seems to still be confused about how to talk about the sudden death of Lindsey Graham, unprepared in the same ways that we are unprepared with death in our own lives. How much of that power and greed follows one into the unknown beyond? When these men meet their maker, alongside those that they had been quoted in saying deserve to be flattened, what happens in that place in the beyond? Do you sit at the same table like a diner and go, well, shoot, sorry, kids? I don't know. We complete our review of chapters 12 to 14, and I couldn't be more grateful for you joining me today. Next week, we will finish our review of the book with chapters 15 to 19, along with the epilogue. I do hope that you'll join me. And if you haven't already yet, I invite you to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and to follow wherever you enjoy connecting with others online. As always, I'll include links for connection in the show notes. And I promise you, it is not just this heavy sweetness like vegetables. There is levity and humor, I promise. A balance. I've got some funny things I've seen online on my Instagram. On Saturdays, I share the random sweetnesses I find online, like the Jude Bellingham look-alike contest that just recently happened. Talk about audacity. Sweetness isn't just always functional. It's varied. So I hope that you'll connect in other ways to have a balance of what makes ink and spine. I offer a concluding reflection today, and it is personal And I hope that you can make space for that for me today. The Titan submersible implosion. I wonder if you were as enthralled by this tragedy as I was. I watched everything I could find about Stockton Rush and the Titan submersible itself. As I watched the multiple interviews and press features, it seemed so ominous. The way Stockton casually described the controllers inside of the vessel, the numerous warnings from former employees and other submersible experts. As an aside, I learned a lot about James Cameron, and that is a man who has a lot of lore. Maybe we'll talk about it another time, but what a fascinating man. But I didn't know that I was actually watching an articulation of my compacted capsule of existence. I'd spent my entire life taking on more and more, in the same ways as this Titan submersible with each trip down and back up again was cracking and becoming more vulnerable. I had become accustomed to accepting harms and abuses so silently, believing and thinking that working more and harder, sleeping less, would secure my freedom. I remember at one point in time a few years ago doing 2 Orange Theory classes a day. One at 5 a.m. before my workday began, and one at 5 p.m. before my workday continued. But that last trip of the submersible, well, that reminds me of what is happening now. To me and to my body. There is no human vessel that is made to withstand all of this. This is not letting go. This is taking on a pressure and a weight that has compounded beyond what a human being can withstand. This is to accept an existence of being buried while still alive for the comfort of those who have a home, a tribe, family on Christmas, Father's Day, Mother's Day, and are able to subvert the consequence of their intentional actions and choices. This is to accept an existence that satiates the periodic and superfluous check-ins of those who believe that they are allies, checking the contradictory boxes of their world vision, donation, while witnessing such dehumanization. It is superfluous indeed. And now it has come at the expense of my ability to live. It's not an equitable trade-off, not by any metric. Truly letting go is honoring the reality of what is to be human, to be free, the dignity of a future that can be without the imposition of oppression and these shackles of consequences that are of someone else's doing. I can't place origin on this quote, but I'm going to attribute this to Nina Simone, but I recently read, "Who benefits when people are taught to accept injustice today in exchange for promises tomorrow?" I think about this as that seemed to be what was given to me in my previous advocacy. Oh, you'll figure it out. You'll bootstrap it. I worked at a mill 25 years ago. There's nothing real about any of that. Because in the present, in what is real now, nothing has been resolved for me to regain my humanity. As I am so grateful for the opportunity to have this space, to have a voice, to create my voice again, I'm humbled to learn that I've spent so much of my life thus far propelled forward by promises and moving goalposts. But remaining blind to the reality of the present has done me no benefit. I'm learning that it is not fear. It is not slothfulness. It is not distraction or a lack of focus that has kept me in this incorrect grave. It is actually a lack of audacity. It is that perpetual programming of being a good firstborn daughter of immigrants. I've spent my whole life trying to be good enough, killing myself to be good enough. And as I have made countless people richer, more enriched, here I am in this grave. So as I better understand how to be more effective in advocating for my freedom so that I don't have to stay in this grave for much longer, I become acquainted with Audacity. And if Audacity is the shovel that I can use to dig out of this grave, I will dig myself out. My prayer now evolves to something new. And I hope that this prayer is helpful for you, whatever entity in the beyond that you believe in. Give me arms to dig. Fortify my spirit until the digging frees my body from this grave. Give me audacity so I no longer stray from my humanity and freedom. Amen. Inshallah. So it is. Thank you so much for joining me again in today's reflection of Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. I do hope you'll join me again next week as we complete a reflection of this incredible book. After next week's episode, let me prepare you for what is to come. We switch gears, a sweet palate cleanser. We transition to something that I love so much, a sports docuseries. I hope you'll join me not only for the ending of this book, but also for that transition into a different kind of sweetness, a different kind of sustenance with sports. As always, I invite you to subscribe with the most grateful heart. I hope you take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon. Sweetness.